Good evening.
Good evening.
How are you all doing? Good. So Kimberly and Tony and I had an opportunity to talk earlier this week, and after that conversation, I told Wendy that we would probably be able to take a break from this conversation at around 11:30, 12 o'clock tonight. So just so you all are aware. Delighted to talk with you all again.
Thank you, Adam. Likewise.
The theme of tonight is moving from service to justice. And so I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about your perspectives on the distinction between service and justice and the relationship you see between those two things.
Well, first I'd like to say good evening to everyone. From where I'm sitting, you all look great. And I just, again, want to give kudos to Wendy and her team. Isn't this a wonderful event? It really is an honor to be here. Yes, it really is a wonderful event. It's an honor to be here and just to feel the spirit, to have the beautiful music that was here, and the food was delicious, wasn't it? See, this for me is a part of From Service to Justice. Because a lot of times we forget about the people who provide service. So the wait staff was excellent today, right? The students that checked us in provided wonderful service. And for me, it is an injustice to forget about the people whose shoulders we stand on and who did work for us to get in the room. So we sit in this room standing on the shoulders of many who came before us, because there were times that in a city like Baltimore, we did not look this rainbowish, right? We did not look as colorful as we look in this room. So for me, the clarity around doing justice work is to understand the historic injustice, and that if we do our service without a clarity of that injustice, we only work to create dependency. And we provide service in a way that becomes more of an opiate to the people rather than an engine for organizing. So for me, that's the distinction, how we, number one, recognize that there isn't one service in this country that people did not organize to make happen. The reason we have a 40-hour work week is because of the organizing that social workers did. And so part of what SWCOS can do is bring social work back to its history of organizing and some of the macro practice that you do. So that's why it was an honor for me to be here, because there are very few schools of social work that understand the value of organizing and the value of consistent organizing. So when we do our service without a clarity around the injustice and without a clarity around organizing, we do a disservice to the people that we say we want to serve.
Tony?
Great. Well, it's kind of blowing my mind, a school of social work that has a focus on organizing.
Yeah.
Really trying to get my mind around that. Well, good evening. I was born in Baltimore, not very far from here, and left shortly after that and came back 22 years later to go to medical school here. And the experience, I grew up in Montreal, Canada, the experience of coming back to Baltimore at the age of 22 and landing in East Baltimore in the mid-1980s radically changed my life course. It shocked me to no end. It continues to shock me. Although Baltimore has changed quite a bit, there's still very clear evidence of the apartheid history of this city and this country. It was so patently obvious to me, and I tell this story a lot. I was being driven around by an upperclassman, and when I first got to East Baltimore, and he saw this look of shock on my face, because I didn't really know what I was looking at. And he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I managed to stammer out something like, "When was there a war here?" And I'll never forget what he said to me. He looked at me with this look of utter disdain. And he said, "What'd you expect? It's the inner city." And I thought, at the age of 22, I thought, I'm supposed to expect this? And you've got a name, and it's labeled, and it's walled off, and it's pushed off out of sight, out of mind. And for me, I couldn't help but think, having been born here, what would my life have been if I had grown up in East Baltimore, where I was treating children in and around Hopkins Hospital every day. And what struck me, and to this day, it's kind of a framing I use for trying to understand health in the context of politics that we see around us, is that there are people who believe that health is a technocratic concern, that we can bring technology and innovation and medicine and solve health problems. And that's true to some extent, but it's nowhere close to sufficient. I argue that health is a democratic concern. And the only way to improve both individual and community health is to invest in the creation of social, political, and economic power in a critical mass of people living in the communities that are experiencing the worst inequities. And that is health, and that's what we're doing in California with that philosophy, that health is about power, and that fundamentally, health is political, small p political.
Do you want to? We can have more of a conversation, but I have more questions too. Kim, you talked about dependency. Do you all think that the people that are provided service become dependent on the services that are provided? Or is it the case that the political, economic, and social systems become dependent and are dependent on the existence of poverty, on the existence of exclusion, oppression, exploitation, marginalization? And if it's the latter, how do we start to dig at that in the way, Tony, you were saying we need to do to really build social, political, and economic power in communities?
Well, I would say that it is, in fact, the latter, that the majority of us in this room, myself included, we make money off poor people. We write grants, we provide services, and it's rare that the work that we're doing to write grants and provide services are for the wealthy. And we come up with all different ways to describe the poor people, vulnerable communities. What are some other ways that we describe poor communities?
Underserved,
at risk,
marginalized.
At risk, disadvantaged. What are other ways? Over there, we didn't hear from anybody. What are some other ways we talk about poor people? Yeah, because see, this is we're talking, but we all talking. Because for me as an organizer, this is just a community meeting. So how are some other ways we talk about, you know what I'm saying? This is just a community meeting. So what are some other ways we talk about poor folks? Under-resourced. We talk about their need, but we rarely talk about the fact that we need them so that we can get our funds. So the dependency that we create is really how we get our needs met by saying that we're providing services to people who need them, as opposed to seeing that we're really in a partnership. I'm not saying that people don't need services. I want to be very clear. But it is difficult to, you see, there's a social narrative in this country about poor people. Would you agree? And that social narrative largely says that they're poor because they're what? See how we said that like a choir? Like they're lazy. So if I have internalized the message that people are poor because they're lazy, they don't want nothing, they're living off the system, and they're trifling, that's what we've been socialized to believe. Then why would I engage in a partnership relationship with them that says honestly and upfront, we need to really change? Because every one of our systems in this country, some people would say they're either working the way they were designed to work or they're broke. And so the challenge for us as organizers is in how we amass people to develop the power that Doc was talking about that makes healthcare a human right and not a technical give a pill and get a treatment plan. But it's around my health as a Black woman in America is my ability to organize to make a difference and be engaged with people who I know are organizing with me to make a difference. So I don't want a doctor to ask me, what am I eating? I want the doctor to be engaged with me to understand what's eating me. And when I know that doctor can understand what's eating me, and we can have a conversation about that, then we can organize. Otherwise, it's just a dependency that keeps me coming back to get the pill.
Tony?
Yeah, well, I think, sometimes we set up dichotomies that I think are not always helpful. And I grew up in a world of services as a physician. People get sick, you treat them. I like to say when you walk into a community and their fire is burning, what's the first thing you do? Is you grab a hose and you put out the fire. And then you high five and you go drink a Budweiser and you say that was a great job. And then you get up the next day and you go back in the same community and their fire is burning in exactly the same places. What do you do then? Well, you put out the fires again. But now you're thinking, maybe I don't want to get a Budweiser. Maybe I want to think about why are there fires burning in exactly the same places? And what can I do to essentially prevent those fires? And so while you're thinking about preventing fires, you still have to put out fires.
Right.
Because that's real pain, real people, real human suffering. And services are designed to essentially attend to that. But you can't just service. You have to think about how do you get underneath that and get to the root causes. So we did this thing when I was running a health department in Oakland, California. We were a $120 million department as part of an $800 million agency that provided services. 95% of what we did was provide services. And it used to frustrate me because every budget cycle we would hear, we need more money for more services. And the people that came to essentially claim those resources were largely white professional people. They were doctors, nurses, dentists, social workers, case managers, probation officers. And so I said, I just want to know where all this money is going. $800 million a year. So we took out a map, a GIS map, and we plotted every service in Alameda County for a year. And we found that there were these concentrations of places where people were getting served by the public health department, by the probation department, by parole, by social services. All of these service providers were descending on these communities, and at the height, it was $6,000 per household in some of our highly served communities. This service industrial complex was really just servicing these communities. And then we thought about, okay, well, that's a lot of money. Where does that money go? And the reality is that at 4:15 in the afternoon, that money got on the freeway and drove out to the suburbs and reinvested itself in housing, private schools, restaurants. None of that money was recirculating in that community. And we literally asked ourselves, would we be better off just giving these people $6,000 per household? Maybe they could do something with it that we can't as service providers. Now, I'm a service provider. I'm not trying to denigrate service provision. I think it's absolutely critical. But if that's all we do,
That's right.
how are we actually going to transform communities in the way that they deserve to be transformed? How are we going to facilitate people transforming their own communities in the way that they deserve to be able to do and that they know how to do? So I do think that there is this tendency in our professional worlds to label people and then service them. Mm-hmm. And the servicers are good people, but when it comes down to solving the problem, they just say, just give me more money and I'll provide more services and I will solve the problem. That is not true. We will not solve these problems with services. We need different solutions.
And I love the analogy around the fire, and we keep going to put the fire out, and maybe we don't have a beer, but we think. But I also find that the other thing that happens is that when we keep going to put the fire out in the same neighborhood, we start blaming the people. Mm-hmm. And we start saying, so we'll develop another program around fire safety.
Yeah.
And then we'll develop another program around fire safety for children under 12. And then we'll develop another program for fire safety, for how to take care of your pets. And then you get the point, right? So we will continue developing another program because, again, those people, something is wrong with them, as opposed to really looking at, well, the neighborhood was built on a toxic dump that in the ground had flammables that any little change in heat or friction will cause a fire.
Right.
But we will blame the people.
And service provision is very, very expensive. And that's part of how it justifies itself.
Right.
It's, like I said, it's doctors, nurses, professionals, people who've been to school who command salaries. And the challenge is that they are not the problem, but they're the instrument of the problem. And so it's hard to challenge that without sometimes people feeling like you're challenging them. And that's not what I'm saying. I don't think that's what we're saying. It's the system that basically says that this is the only way to address these problems. I argue that our problem is not a lack of money. It's a lack of critical thinking. Mm-hmm. We don't actually look at the root causes. We don't actually explore what it would take to get underneath these problems, and that's on us. Despite all of the degrees and all of these fancy schools, we do not exercise good critical thinking.
And so then how do we challenge folks that I call gatekeepers who are not the system, but they maintain the system? That, many times gatekeepers will work in institutions and think that they own the gate, but that they're just, so how do we challenge gatekeepers to think critically? Because so many times gatekeepers will be very well-intended and who go into whatever their profession is, really wanting to make a difference. I don't believe there's anyone who gets in the helping professions that says, I want to come in and really hurt people.
Right.
I fundamentally do not believe that. So it then causes me to think critically around what are the key questions that we as gatekeepers, the representatives of systems and institutions that provide services, what are the key questions that we have to ask around, what is it that when I came into this job X number of years ago, I had all this vigor and all this excitement and all this desire to make a difference. And now, X number of years later, I'm counting on my retirement and saying, I don't know if anything's going to change, but I've only got 2 more years to go.
Boy, you've obviously had a lot of conversations with these folks. That's
Yes.
exactly what they say. Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting to me, and I thank Baltimore for this, quite frankly, because after that experience of having landed in East Baltimore and being asked to treat what I called social ills with pills, it made no sense to me. So it set me off on this career trajectory to try to figure out, well, what does make sense? And one of the things that it led me to do was to actually look at measures of health status. Life expectancy in particular. And it was during the time when geographic information systems or fancy mapping was coming online, so we were able to calculate the average age to which somebody could expect to live in every neighborhood across a community. And we did this in Oakland, we found 25 years of life expectancy difference between the Oakland flatlands and the Oakland hills. The flatlands were where lower income people lived and the hills were where wealthy people lived. And we came back to Baltimore, worked with the Baltimore City Health Department, did the same calculation, and Baltimore has neighborhoods with life expectancies in the high 50s. And again, when you have to apply critical thinking skills to this, you look at that, you can't explain that difference based on lack of access to health care.
That's right.
You can't explain that difference based on smoking behaviors, drinking, eating fatty foods, whatever. There's something much more fundamental going on there. And the thing that correlates best, and Baltimore has done a beautiful job of actually documenting its history. There's a book called Not in My Neighborhood, written by a Baltimore Sun reporter, which talks about the apartheid of Baltimore and how it was legally, there was racial zoning in Baltimore that led to racially restrictive covenants and all of the racial steering. I mean, Baltimore has done a great job chronicling its racism. And what correlates well with these life expectancy differences is that racism. And so you're forced, and I think with professionals, and I teach at a school of public health, there's a tendency to essentially try to stamp out people's common sense in these schools. And you develop a culture, this professional culture, which is, that I know how to do this. I've got statistical skills, I've got epidemiology skills, I can do these things. But you forget at some point that the people that you're working with know things too.
That's right.
And in many instances, they know much better than you what's shaping their opportunity. And we have to enlist their expertise in explaining, in my case, these maps of 25 years, 30 years of life expectancy difference across a city that's 1.5 miles wide. I mean, they can tell you what's happening there. You ask the doctors, clueless. They'll tell you that it's some pill that they should be putting in the water in one neighborhood and not in another. I'm not even kidding you. I'm not even kidding you. So I think that one of the ways to challenge that gatekeeper mentality is to actually force people to explain the data, force them to enlist their own critical thinking skills to explain what they're seeing. And if they have integrity, they will recognize that their explanations don't fully explain what's happening.
And I think part of the critical thinking that will allow us to have that conversation and that level of analysis of data is to really, as my mother would say, have the starch in our backs enough to talk about race and racism straight up. We as a nation do not know how to have a conversation about race and racism. Would you agree? We don't know how to have a conversation about it. We will excuse, and I think it was about maybe 30 years ago, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that the New England Journal of Medicine put out race as the independent variable for health outcomes, and it was not access. It continues not to be. It is not education, but it is race. There are videos that I'm sure many of you may have seen called Unnatural Causes, which clearly document the fact we are a nation that is designed with the imposition of the ideology of race.
If I could just suggest, when we say race, we're talking about racism.
Yes.
And I think sometimes we hide behind race. It's not about race. Race is a social construct. It's been disproven as having any meaning genetically. We're talking about racism. I like to say I don't see race, I see racism. And I see it everywhere. I see it structurally, you see the legacy of it in how our cities are laid out. Again, it's the biggest explanatory variable for those life expectancy differences that you see. And what's really shocking about it is that it's not just hurting people of color.
That's right.
It's the lack of solidarity in our country, which it makes us unwilling to support universal policies. That's why we're the only country in the developed world that doesn't have universal health care, doesn't have universal child care, doesn't have any number of universal policies that virtually every other developed Western country has. It's because of race, racism.
And
because we don't see ourselves in other people, and we don't want to, therefore, extend benefits to those people. Now that's coming back in a boomerang fashion, and it's killing white people throughout America. That's what's happening with the opiate crisis, with alcoholism and suicide, which is driving a white mortality crisis that is unprecedented. It has killed more white Americans than the entire HIV/AIDS epidemic in the United States. It's the biggest epidemiologic phenomenon we've seen for 100 years. And we're ignoring it. We're not engaging critical thinking skills to explain what is happening.
And for me as an organizer, it may be semantics, but for me to really understand racism, the root word is race. And so it is, because for me, built into the social construct and the ideology of the concept of race itself is a bias in favor of people that we've come to call white. So I'm an anti-racist organizer, but a part of that humanistic work is understanding what the racialization process, because we've all been racialized. Because when my ancestors came here, they weren't black. People who were in the room who we've come to call white, your ancestors weren't white. There was a racialization process that is a dehumanizing process. And so to really understand that process is a part of what helps me be more of a critical thinker, and to be more effective in addressing racism is to understand the history of race, because what so many folks in a race-based society where folks don't want to have the conversation or don't know how to have a conversation that doesn't end up in a brawl is folks will go to one of the other isms to marginalize racism, right? We'll go to classism or, you know, any kind of genderism or ableism or, you know, and race will then become marginalized and the conversation about racism is over. So for me, they are part and parcel. That to be effective to bring folks together, I think you said something that's really key. We have to see how people that we've come to call white have been dehumanized because of the concept of race. And then we have this data that I wasn't aware of until you said it, about the numbers of white people who are dying with this phenomenon. And until we make it a sum value for all of us, then it makes critical thinking about it, I think, more difficult.
So we've been talking about the sort of the dialectic between service and advocacy, which seems to be a cornerstone of social work practice. And I'm reminded of a quote from what you've been saying from the Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton, who said, "You don't fight fire with fire, you fight fire with water. You don't fight racism with racism, you fight racism with solidarity. You don't fight capitalism with black capitalism, you fight capitalism with socialism." So I wonder how you all think we can move towards, and particularly for people who are engaged in services, who are providing services, and for people in the philanthropic community, and people who are running programs, how do we change the relationship dynamics so that we are intentionally getting at these deeper issues? We're intentionally building power, we're intentionally building solidarity, and not just fostering resilience, but fostering resistance and pushing people to reconstruct the world in a different way.
Well, so I want to offer some good news, because I don't want everybody to be depressed, and I tend to be an optimist. And I like to tell people I'm from California, so I'm from the future. So what's happening to us now is going to happen to you.
That's right. Coming to your neighborhood.
So in California, we have, and it's never done, but we have effectively changed the narrative around who matters. And we've created an inclusive narrative in California, and it's creating new policy that is inclusive. I'll give you some examples. In California, we took on the issue of the school-to-prison pipeline. 800,000 suspensions and expulsions of young kids, mostly kids of color, African American, Native American, Southeast Asian, and Latino boys being suspended and expelled from California schools in 2011, 2012. Long story short, we took on this issue because this issue was presented to us by community. In fact, it was not an issue that we as a foundation saw as a health issue, but our communities challenged us. And it took us 2 years to finally agree this was a huge issue that had significant health implications. And we worked with communities to organize them to build power. And these communities tackled their local districts, they created networks, they created regional approaches to school discipline reform, and then they took on the state legislature. And they drove, this is during a year, Jerry Brown is our governor. This was a year when Jerry Brown had just started, and he said, I'm not signing anything that costs more than a nickel. And we got 5 bills through on school discipline that year over his veto. And those bills have cut California suspensions and expulsions in half as of this year. We're down 50%, including in African American kids, Native American kids. And
That's great. That's great.
And in some districts, they're almost down to 0. This is doable. California is doing it, and it's because of a narrative of inclusion, because we are putting at the center of this boys and men of color, formerly incarcerated people, LGBTQ, undocumented people. They're telling their story. They're humanizing themselves. This is what an anti-racist practice looks like. People have to be able to tell their own story and see the shared humanity across race, across place, across age. And that's happening in California. It's not only in school discipline. We've changed the criminal justice system. We now have 1 million Californians who have the ability to reclassify their former low-level felonies as misdemeanors. They don't have to check the box on housing or employment applications. We've got undocumented kids covered under the Medicaid program. We've put almost 5 million people on health insurance through the Obamacare program. And California is on the move because the narrative is changing. As I said, I'm from the future, I'm from your future. This is going to happen here, and it's not going to happen by itself. It's going to take work. It's going to take the work of organizers, people who actually have critical thinking skills, who recognize that we all do better when we all do better. And we can't continue this scarcity mentality, zero sum, I lose if you win. That's the politics that's driving this scarcity mentality that's creating essentially the status quo. We can change it. It's changing in California. It's changing in other parts of the United States. So I just want you to know that that's your future if you want it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I would just add to that, that part of ways that we begin changing the relationship between providers and people in community is, ask, why do we call people clients? They're people, but we're trained to call them clients. When we look at that word, it really means to comply. To comply to what? To whom? Why? So when we really first just look at to whom are we accountable? Because generally speaking, in providing services to communities, a part of what the future, because I'm from Mississippi, which means I'm from the past. I'm just saying. So you don't have the future without the past. Some cosmology would say the present, the future is the past. Because there was a time when what was described was the past. So it's a matter of how we, ma'afa, the way out is back through. So, to whom are we really accountable? Because most service providers use language like accountability and empowerment, right? We have the word empowerment in every other paragraph. And you're right to laugh because, EM means what? The prefix EM means what, critical thinkers? The ability to give. So if I can give it to you, I can do what? I can take it away. And so one of the things that we can do to change that relationship, I believe, Adam, between providers and people in community is to, number one, collectively come together to analyze power. Most of us who say we want to empower community really have not done a power analysis. So we have to analyze power in our community. Who has it and who doesn't? And then once we do that analysis of power, then how do we really look at systems and institutions that have historically disempowered communities, yet we are there saying that we want to empower the community. And so one of them is to really learn, what is the service that we provide? What is that history? And what is the service that we've provided? What is the history in the communities that we're in? Because in many organizers that I've worked with and I'm learning from, the ability to learn, to know the history and to learn the history has been critical in developing relationships with folk in community. The ability, because most of us are accountable up. We're not accountable to the people that we're making money off of. So how do we develop a real authentic relationship that we can, and we're not saying you shouldn't be accountable to where you get the funds, but it's been my experience that when we organize with folks from community, about 25 years ago, I was working in a community that a large funder came in, public housing in New Orleans, and basically told the residents that they wanted to start a teenage pregnancy prevention program. And the residents, who a lot of organizing, their organizing started because they wanted to have a Halloween party. They went to the local grocery store to get a donation. And the local grocery store gave them 2 bags of candy. So they went back to their resident council meeting with a high level of festivity. And so they decided they wanted to collect some data. So they knocked on every one of those 5,000 doors in that public housing development and asked 2 questions. How much do you spend a month and where do you shop? They went back to that grocery store and said, we know that you exist because people don't go from all parts of town to shop in the grocery store that's in public housing or near public housing. So they were clear that you exist because we shop here. So they said, if you don't respect us enough to give us more than 2 bags of candy, we're going to have a buying campaign, and we're going to stop buying here. The store took the hinges off the door and said, come get what you want. Right? But that allowed them to understand their collective power as a community, right? So they were then able to organize in a way that when the funder came and said, we want a teenage pregnancy prevention program, they said, well, first let us tell you what we need in our community. That we're not going to do because we understand that. So for New Orleans, it was the Irish Channel versus Lakeview, where we have a 30-year difference in life expectancy based on zip code. And so what the women in public housing understood, that we understand that the pregnancy rate in Lakeview is the same as the pregnancy rate here. So are you partnering with them to do a teenage pregnancy prevention program? What we're concerned about is police brutality in our community. What we're concerned about is our kids don't have jobs. We're concerned about it, there's no community center. So the folks in the neighborhood, in the community, were able to say, these are the terms that we want to engage. And if you're willing to engage with us in those terms, we can rock and roll with you. Yeah. But if you're just here for community, for teenage pregnancy prevention, that's not what our greatest concern is right now. So they were able to develop the kind of relationship that there was accountability to the community and within the community, because it's not that just folks should be accountable to communities, but how are we in community accountable to each other? How do we work in ways that we can speak with a clear voice so that when we go to speak truth to power, we're not speaking a multiple of truths, realizing that there are multiple truths are true at the same time, but what's our priority of truth right now that's pressing in our community that we can, with one voice, speak to community? Because a lot of organizations will get a community representative to then be the one that speaks or to represent community, but not ensuring that that person is really speaking to folks in community, being asked to speak for community, and speaking what the collective community has asked them to say. Because it's real, we're easy in many organizations to find the one outreach, the one person for a focus group or the one representative, but they're not speaking to community and speaking the voice of community. So that responsibility is both ways. It's not just for those of us as gatekeepers, but how we develop relationships with people, not clients, but people in community, that they're really, speaking their own voice.
Let me just provoke you around your question. Yeah. So I'm going to argue that it's not the right question. You can't move from service to advocacy. And that it's not the same people, it's not the same kind of work. And we should hope that service providers, and I'm just trying to provoke you, I'm not sure that I actually believe this. We should hope that service providers provide high quality, equitable, accessible services. And their goal at some metaphysical level has to be, I want to work to put myself out of business. I want to, at some point, no longer be necessary. But the reality is, I think that this change happens through organizing. And I don't think you can teach an old dog new tricks. I think I come from the healthcare world. And we have, for 25 years, been trying to get the Johns Hopkinses of the world to engage in community health. And over that 25 years, every 5 years, I have some massive fit, and I realize that there's no way that these institutions are ever going to do this. So what I started to say to myself was, maybe I just want them to provide really high-quality health care that's, equitable, that's accessible, and just get out of the way. And let's have power-building organizations do this work and put them out of business because they will reduce the demand for their services. So I'm suggesting, again, not that I entirely believe it, I'm suggesting that maybe we're asking the wrong question, and the service provider should do services, and we should just find ways for institutions to invest much more heavily in organizing.
Well, since you asked me. I mean, I guess, I'll phrase this as a question since I'm moderating and nobody cares what my opinion is here.
We care.
Well, you're very kind. So I guess I wonder, given the power dynamics that exist within institutions like educational institutions, the power dynamics that exist in service providers, the power dynamics that exist within the philanthropic community, whether it is possible to push Hopkins to the side. I mean, it's a question of, and I guess this might be a strategic question. Do you all think it makes sense to say, well, Hopkins is going to continue to do what Hopkins is going to do, and we're going to try to do something different? Or could we, at the same time that people are coming in and getting services at Hopkins, could we be working to engage them not merely in the provision of services, but to talk about what's underlying this, right? When people come into service provider sites, it seems, again, from my experience working in service provision, we often talk about what they need that day, but we don't talk about the underlying conditions that are creating that need. And if the people who are coming to us with needs, if we can work with them to develop critical consciousness, and I wonder how we can do that, doesn't that create the seeds for something new? It might not be that in the context of Hopkins this is all going to happen, but it doesn't. I wonder, do you all think there really needs to be a separation and never the two shall meet? Yeah, let me ask that.
Excuse me. One of the things that comes to mind for me when I think about hospitals, and not just hospitals, but the child welfare system and other institutions, is that when I think about their history, they didn't serve certain communities. That those communities provided those services for themselves, right? So that's just something that I often think about. Let's say a child welfare system, that the history of it that I know about wasn't designed to serve Black and brown children. Yet our children are overrepresented in those systems and the services that they provide. So that just causes me to ponder a lot. What then happens to a community that has historically provided services for itself that now is being served by systems and institutions. And I'm not sure what the difference in terms of the outcomes, how much better the outcomes for those that those systems were not historically designed to serve, how much better their outcomes are today. So that's just something that, as we talk about your question, Adam, I'm led to think about. And the other thought is, say your question one more time.
Well, I guess the question is, does it need to be one or the other?
Well,
Can
yeah.
it be that people who are providing services are also engaging simultaneously in organizing, and those who are engaging in organizing and advocacy are simultaneously providing basic needs, because it would be impossible to organize somebody who's hungry, just as it's impossible to educate somebody who's hungry or to do anything else?
Well, as was said, it's not a dichotomous.
Mm-hmm.
We in the West are real socialized around a dichotomous logic, and don't often think about diunital logic frames. And so for me, dichotomous logic says, if you are in need, then something's wrong with you. It's a kind of an either or. Where diunital law, and so then if something's wrong with you, it's easier, not that it always happens, but it's easier not to see the humanity of that person and not work from that place of humanity. Whereas dichotomous logic says that we are all fully human beings. And in that process, there are things that all human beings need. And there are things that some of us as human beings will address more effectively than others. Are there people in services that have a narrative of people who need services being treated as less than human? I think we've all seen it. Some of the most inhuman treatment that I've experienced as a human being is in human services. So are there people in human services that do everything they can to bring their full humanity to the table? Absolutely. We've seen it. And again, one of the reasons why this event is so important is because, community organizing in some places is a bad word. To actually the practice of, the art and the science of community organizing, bringing people together for an intended purpose. And, so much has been happening around muddying the waters, I think, between us not being clear around activism, organizing, movement building, and mobilization. Those are not all the same things, all important, but for me, the organizing piece, what distinguishes movement building from mobilization is we saw mobilization with the Women's March here in DC at the beginning of last year. And every person who was there had a different reason why they were there.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
They were mobilized, but it wasn't a movement.
Mm-hmm.
A movement says no matter who is there, I'm clear about while I'm there.
Mm-hmm.
I've been brought together for an intended purpose, and I'm clear about that purpose. So, to me, that's a part of the diunital nature of organizing, is that you want to bring a large number of people together, which some folks would just call mobilizing, but once you get them together, they're clear about their purpose, and they're clear about their direction, and they're clear about their vision, and they have a critical way to think about it. So for me as an organizer, that's the diunital thing. So it's not either or, it's both and, but how we do that with a set of values, and how we do that with a set of principles that then guide us.
So, please.
Yeah, I'll say quickly. As I said earlier, I think these problems are political problems. Mm-hmm. They're problems with our democracy. And we celebrate our democracy sometimes on the 4th of July, I guess. But we don't invest in our democracy. We make it difficult for people to participate. Elections are on Tuesdays when people are working. We have this complex process to get people to register to vote, and we knock people off the voter rolls all the time. We have all of this hidden money in elections. We have a very sick democracy, and we don't actually invest in it. If we thought that we needed to invest in it, A, we would teach civics in school so
Thank
people
you.
would understand
Thank you.
civics. B, we would invest in organizing. My organization is the biggest funder of community organizing in the United States of America. That shouldn't be the case. There should be funding going to communities to solve these problems through hiring organizers, to hiring people who understand how to bring people together, to enlist their genius to solve these problems. But we don't do it. We don't do it. We actually divest. We think community organizing is a bad word. We think advocacy is a bad word. We won't fund it. Government won't fund it. Philanthropy, maybe sometimes will fund it. So it struggles. And as a consequence, we don't have these comprehensive, effective solutions being deployed in places like Baltimore, which screams out for it every day. It's just screaming out for it. So I don't understand that. I think that there's some sort of critical thinking gap, which is probably shrouded in racism, because everything else in the United States is shrouded in racism. You know, we just don't want to do it because we don't want to help them, and we think that them is not us, and therefore we're not doing it. I'm sorry, that's the way, that's what it comes down to. Is the only way to break through that is to change the power dynamics. You've got to actually build critical mass of power amongst people who can actually hold systems accountable for a different way of performing. It's the only way meaningful social change has ever happened in this country. And I can't imagine any other approach, particularly in social work, to these entrenched problems that manifest themselves day in, day out in places like Baltimore, in places like Oakland, where I live. So I feel pretty good. I think we actually know how to do this, and we're doing it, and we need to do more of it. And I think you know how to do it, and you need to do more of it, and so we should celebrate.
So one last question, because, well, not last question, but for this. 50 years ago, 2 weeks ago, Dr. King was assassinated. And among his last writings, he put forward the question to us, where do we go from here, community or chaos? And it really does feel like we're at a tipping point, whether, with global climate change, with economic inequality, with racial tensions and injustice and oppression that exists. We really have to ask that question, where do we go from here, community or chaos? And so what would you all say? What are our next steps? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's already been said that we go to organizing. We really, the community piece is how we bring folks together with a sense of clarity. We organize. We organize with a sense of humanity. We organize with a sense of hope. We organize with a sense of believing that we can make change. Sometimes folks don't really have I believe within the fiber of my being that we can make transformational change. Many carry the narrative, oh, I'll believe that when I see it. Well, I believe it first. I believe that when we truly believe that people can come together collectively to make a system that's not a do-right system, do right. Because we put people in offices and expect them to do right, and we leave them. Mm-hmm. And then we get angry at them because they didn't do right. Well, we put them in a system that wasn't right. So
we don't hold them accountable.
And then we don't hold them accountable. But we're the ones that then supported them getting in there and then support the Fed. So to me, it's organizing. So it's no one answer, but how no matter where we're doing, no matter what we're doing and where we're doing it, how we make sure that we keep people engaged in a democratic way to organize for transformation.
I think you either believe in democracy or you don't. And people should just admit it if they don't. Maybe get out of the way. I also believe in the wisdom of crowds. I think that you get better answers when more people are engaged in trying to solve the problem. That's been demonstrated over and over and over again, yet I think there's this academic model, which is like we've studied it in a lab, and now we're going to take those controlled laboratory conditions and apply them in the real world, and then try to force them to work publish papers that basically say, well, they worked in the lab, but they didn't work in the real world. But we need to do more research in the lab to figure out how we can make it work in the lab and work in the real. Come on. Let's recognize that these are problems of civic engagement. There's great science in health, and I imagine that it applies in social work as well, around agency. The ability of people to feel like they have control. They have, the ability to essentially advance their cause, both individually and collectively. And I call our work the ABCs. We believe in agency, which is A. There's another body of research which is around belonging, a sense of feeling seen, heard, your full humanity being shared with those around you, being able to see yourself in others, and others see themselves in you. That's critical. That's B. And then C, this is the one that drives me the craziest. Because every time around this year, there's a newspaper article, or there's a bunch of newspaper articles about some black or brown kid in some, godforsaken place who's got accepted into every Ivy League school. And they tell the story of this kid and his hardworking parents, and, isn't that great how this kid got into Harvard and Yale and Penn and everything? And I'm like, why is this news? Of course there are black and brown kids that are brilliant and genius. It's this, we celebrate this notion of people beating the odds all the time. But we set the odds. So we need to change the odds. That's what C stands for. It's like, instead of helping people just beat the odds with services, one person at a time, let's collectively change the odds. Because there are odds. I argue that they are man-made, and they can be unmade, largely by the work of women. They can be unmade. So agency, belonging, change the odds. It's a simple prescription for, and there's scientific literature to back up every one of those things. We can do this. It's being done. Let's do it.
Thank you both for this conversation. And it really, to me, says that the old adage, right? If you give a person a fish, you'll feed him for a day. If you teach a person to fish, you'll feed them until the shoreline is seized and subsidized for redevelopment. The river or water are polluted upstream, but if you teach people to organize, if you teach people to advocate, then they'll be able to fashion a solution of their own, tapping into the critical consciousness that exists in their community to create a new world. And I'm delighted to have this conversation with you. Wow. And thank you all. The one minor factual correction, Tony, I hate to do this, but in Baltimore, firefighters have natty bows, not Budweiser.